Okay, Brian, I'm going to let you kick this off because I think you've got a better question to start talking about this video than I do.
So the question is they kind of answer this. They were definitely living in a simulation. So why do we believe we're in a simulation? Why do people like Elon Musk say that if he had a question asked AGI, which they talk about here, he would say, "Who made the simulation?" Heisenberg basically started that. So if you watch the movie Oppenheimer, you've been introduced to the scientist Heisenberg, and he discovered what we call Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. And it kind of works like this. At the quantum level, if I was looking at a rose and it was red, and you were looking at the rose and it was red, anytime somebody looked at it, it was red. And then you looked away. No conscious beings or video cameras, which obviously had to be created by a conscious being, existed and were pointed at this rose. It just turns to black. But as you look at it, color appears. So computer scientists now use the term simulation because that's kind of how video games work, right? As you're going through a video game, a first player role playing video game, this the graphics and things are rendered as you look, right? As you fill in, as you see things coming up, that's when they're created. And so Heisenberg's uncertainty principle has demonstrated that consciousness is required to interpret and to see reality. Without consciousness, all of reality changes. Observing it changes what we're observing.
All right, I've
Does that
got
make sense?
questions straight off the bat here, and this is a simple one. I have a camera that I'm looking at, and it can see behind me. So I am now seeing my background without turning my head. But that's because this camera is showing me what's there. But I can also flip that camera. So you can mirror your image and you can also flip your image, right? So it would kind of, that picture behind me would be over there and vice versa, right? So there was something you mentioned there about it it's created by humans, right? So it's in the way that humans see things. But that's not right, right? Based on what you just said. Like, because I can flip that camera to move things around. So if I turn around, that picture's always going to be there. Like if I turn that way, that picture's still over there. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so sort of. So I was careful in my I did not say humans, I said conscious beings. So I believe the test straight, and this is hard to nail down because if a dog is observing the quantum world, does it collapse the wave function? Well, we would then also have to observe it. So, or you'd have to have a camera recording the dog observing. So we don't really know for certain. And you guys correct me, Greg or Chuck, if you come across some experiment that somehow was able to demonstrate that other conscious beings, other living beings, animals, observing things changes the reality. And so that's point number one, that it's possible that any conscious being changes the observation. But what you're talking about is perspective, I believe, Rob. That from a different perspective, whether it's a mirror or whatever else, that rose is still red. I'm saying the rose and the existence of it, the color of it, if you extrapolate out what we see at the quantum level to all of reality, you would now be able to say, well, maybe let's get real crazy. If there was no cameras and there were no conscious beings observing parts of the world, do those parts even exist? Or do they just show up as we look at them? Right? Like that is the very, I think, furthest extrapolation from what we can take from what Heisenberg observed, proved at the quantum level. Some thoughts on that, or maybe some corrections. But I think it's slightly different than what you're saying, Rob, which, if I'm understanding your question, is more of a perspective than a existence of.
It sounds like it. I, I am never going to ask the question that beats the physicists at this point, but it is interesting the way that this is framed, and you have to be very particular about which box you put everything in because there's so many different ways to go with this. Anyway, continue.
So I'll let Greg and Chuck clarify or correct anything I just said there if they have any feedback on it.
Everything sounds accurate to me. I mean, there's a logical issue here, and it involves the observer. And that's what we're really talking about is the observer. You have to have the observer for things to happen. So like when I turn my head like this, That's when everything gets rendered that way. The question we asked a second ago is, does it exist if we're not looking at it? Yes, it does exist, but that doesn't mean it visually exists. There are no photons, but that does not mean that the object doesn't exist. Even if this is a simulation, there has to be reference points for it. So it exists somewhere, somehow, just not visual, just not with photons. And that's really what we're discussing right here when we're talking about visual things. We're talking about photons. Okay, the photons are what our eyes are picking up and are seeing. Does that make sense? I would ask if everybody knows what a photon is, but I'm not sure anybody knows what a photon is.
Well, so I think that's a good point, Chuck, because the analogy of the video game is if you're playing the real player, first player game, let's say the stage that you're on is actually developed, right? It does exist. It's not like it's being developed as you go, but as you look at it, that's whenever the visual information is presented. But the layout, the design, where you're going to walk, the different structures, where the zombies are going to come from, and so on, that is there. It's just it's not rendered,
Right.
it's not displayed until you look in that direction, right? So I think that's a very good clarification that I wasn't precise enough with.
In computer games, we often like to think that things don't exist in a computer game until the character views them or sees them or renders them, but that's not the actual reality. The thing that doesn't exist is the visual part of it. The visual doesn't exist, but everything else, all the framework and the logic and everything for it is still there. It's still there, but it exists in a state of change because depending on what you do, it might change. So it's visual. When you do see it, it's going to be different, but it most definitely exists, even in a computer game.
So how does what we're talking about now relate to what Lex Fridman and Roman Yampolskiy are talking about in this video? Because this is important, right?
Well, maybe we should define what a simulation is first. What is a simulation? What I know what I think a simulation is, but I'm curious, Rob. What in your view, what's a simulation? What is it?
I mean, in its simplest form, I would have said we would be the computer game, right? Like a simulation is something that is artificial, almost. It exists, but only to the point that it has been created by something or somebody else, right? So it's like a different, how can I put this? I feel like I want to Google simulation to get the exact definition because that is what I believe it is. But essentially, in its simplest form, I would say it's something like a computer game. So if life is a simulation, then we are all characters in a TV show or a computer game.
Greg, what's your opinion on what is a simulation?
It is something that mocks some other kind of reality. So some kind of other thing. So you can simulate an engine, you can simulate life, you can simulate, you name it. So it's basically a recreation of something that's already been created, in a sense, right? So video games are a recreation of some world, some belief, some whatever. So that's what I see a simulation as.
Brian, what's your take on what a simulation is?
I'm struggling to find the analogy here, Chuck. Maybe you. Well, so there's a difference between a simulation, which is so the Matrix was all in people's brains. There was no physical reality to it. So the Matrix was taking people that they turned into batteries, and they were putting concepts in their mind, and that is not a simulation. The simulation would be something external, and I'm trying to remember the different word that separates the two. It's not those imitation.
I'll tell you how I see simulations, and I actually only see the word in one of those definitions there. But to me, a simulation is a test. You don't create a simulation unless you want to see the results, right? So if you're simulating something, it's because you're experimenting, because to see something, you want to test something, you want to find out whether or not the people inside are worthy, or you want to find out what happens with XYZ, or you want to find out what happened in the past, or it's a test. That's all a simulation is. When I run different simulations, That's what I'm doing. I'm testing things. So if this life, if this universe is a simulation, then that means it's a test. And I think we can find validation for that when you look at the different religious texts, because what does the Bible tell us life is? It tells us it's a test. God is preparing us for him. He's prepping us. We're going through this. We're passing some things, we're failing some things. When we fail, he reteaches us. He reteaches us. So in my perspective and in my mind, a simulation is nothing but a test. Okay.
I think it's a really good analogy. What comes to mind is simulators. I'm an F1 fan, so all drivers are trained and practice daily on simulators, which are replicas of the real racing, and they train their mind through these simulations to be successful at racing. They're testing themselves to get better and better and better. So I think that's a really good explanation. It's kind of what is the simulation, but it's more of the purpose of the simulation
So
is the test. And that comes back to, and this is where I think it gets really interesting and ties into the topics we address in Soulless Intelligence, which is, okay, they go into in this Lex Fridman discussion about, yes, we're in a simulation, which brings up the question, where did the simulation come from? Right? And other questions, can we get out of the simulation? And these are funny because, as you just saw with the etymology, the word simulation hasn't existed for that long, really 60 years, 70 years, something like that. However, these exact same questions humanity has had forever, right? And so one of I would say the most powerful scientific hypothesis to date is 2,300 years old. And when we look at things like, hey, are we in a simulation? It's the same thing the Greek philosophers asked. And so we have to look at the world and say, wait a sec, there's two main worldviews. There's the theological, something outside of the world started everything. And there's the atheist, that is just a bunch of random stuff. When you get to the point where you say, hey, we're in a simulation, only one of those makes sense. So what's the most, I would say, powerful scientific hypothesis? Well, it's science. Science is something that's able to accurately predict the future. So we go back to 2,300 years of the Greek philosophers, and Aristotle said that there has to be a first uncaused cause. He also called it a first mover, two separate proofs for the same thing. That means that we're sitting here today because of things. We saw this interesting topic, and that caused us to be curious, which had caused us to want to talk about it. And you go back to the beginning of time. But at some point, everything had to have an uncaused cause. There had to be something that existed outside of the physical universe that started it all. He also called that the first mover, and used the analogy of potential versus act. Potential that something can have versus its actual actions and moving. So now 2,300 years later, do we have any information that says what he predicted, what he said was the beginning of the universe, something that existed outside of time, matter, space, and energy, is a reasonable prediction? Well, yeah, we have the Big Bang Theory, which says that everything started from an initial spark. We have the law of conservation of matter, conservation of energy. We have Heisenberg's uncertainty principle that says that reality is somewhat rendered, visually at least, whenever we look at it, that a conscious being is necessary to understand reality as it is, and without consciousness, that the reality isn't what we think it is. All of that points to Aristotle's prediction, his scientific hypothesis for reality being the most accurate that we have. The idea that the other side, the atheistic side, that says, wait a sec, this was all just a bunch of stuff smacking together, becomes completely mute once you agree that we're in a simulation. Now that then leads to the next level of questions. Who or what created the simulation? So I'll pause there before we go to the who or what created the simulation thing. Does that track with Aristotle basically making this prediction 2,300 years ago and our current science saying, seems like accurate in that?
Yep. I would say, yeah.
And that's where people get mixed up in science. It's really important to point this out. Science at its core is the ability to accurately predict the future. It does not require physical information, so to speak. Modern science, if we're doing replication of studies, is one thing. But for him to say 2,300 years ago, maybe you say, you know what, that is the science of theology, which is what theology was. Oh, that's the science of philosophy. Well, those things don't have a physical nature or material nature to them, but they're still understanding truth, they're understanding reality. And so they were classically understood as that. As a matter of fact, science as we currently define it, which is just the physical world, most people talk about it, was originally called natural philosophy. It was a subset of ultimate searches for truth. So we've lost that. And for somebody, which I'm sure these arguments come out, oh, well, that's not a scientific statement because it's not something that could be measured. Well, yeah, actually, we observe all of the results of what he predicted 2,300 years ago now, again and again and again and again, and they stick together, versus all of this stuff being random and just happening because, like, that doesn't even add up. So we move on to the next question. Then who created it? Where did it come from?
What's outside it?
Yeah, before we get there though, we're talking about Aristotle. Obviously, that was thousands, I think plural, thousands of years ago. Why have we
300
kind of
BC-ish.
okay, so a couple of thousand years and change. Like, why have we not really got any further than he got in that time? Why do we think we're potentially going to get there with AI? And also, why does this really matter?
Well, I think it would. I don't know that I agree with the first statement. So he set that big picture hypothesis, but he didn't know Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, which still took 22 centuries to discover, right? He didn't understand the Big Bang, which took 22 centuries to discover. He didn't understand the answer to. He understood that something existed outside of the physical reality that had to create it, an uncaused cause or a first mover, something that was pure potential. But he didn't know that thing. He didn't know what that was. He didn't know that you could have a relationship with it. He just knew that it existed. So from a theological perspective, we've gotten a whole lot more clarity on what existed outside of, call it the simulation if you want, but that's just a modern computer science word for what we've called it for 2,300 years. The reality is, if you agree that there's a simulation, then you're agreeing that there is something outside of it. Okay, so then you say, and this is, again, 1,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, they had these same discussions. The same thing that Richard Dawkins says now. So Richard Dawkins in his books, The God Delusion, talks about, well, who created God? All right, so let's play that out. These guys are sitting here and having a conversation about the simulation. They say, okay, well, there was a simulator or a group of simulators. Let's say there's a bunch of them that wrote this program that renders as we look at reality. Okay, let's call these things, let's make up some random name. Let's just call them angels. And let's say they had the goal of helping conscious beings improve and become their best selves. But clearly the simulation has some negative things in it, some glitches. Let's call those demons. And you say, okay, so we have all these angels, we have all these demons. This sounds like what the Greek philosophers came up with to some degree. They had positive deities, they had negative deities. That's what the Romans came up with, which is what basically all pantheistic religions came up with, all naturalist religions across the globe. Good, bad, there's a bunch of them. They're fighting each other, they're helping us, they're hurting us. So maybe they don't care about us. All of these things are mixed into their understanding of religion. But that doesn't answer the question, which is, okay, but where did they come from? Because ultimately, there could be only one thing, only entity that was the first uncaused cause, was the thing that exists outside of time, the thing that exists outside of space, that created all of reality. Now, that thing that created it could have created the Roman gods and then the Greek gods and the Native American gods and so on and so forth, or angels or demons or all of these things. And those things could exist as conscious and don't have physical bodies, all of that could be true, and those things could then create the simulation that we're in, right? There's still this, there could be this hierarchy of 10 or 20 levels. It could be aliens, or put anything you want above us. That still doesn't solve the problem. Ultimately, something has to be the uncaused cause, some one entity. Well, could it be more than one entity? Well, how would that work? So like one thing that creates reality, how could you have another thing create reality? Like that's a complete contradiction. You couldn't have two things simultaneously creating reality, creating the physical world. There has to always start with one. Again, this is how Aristotle got to that fact, the uncaused cause. So I don't know that we've made it beyond his point, other than science has demonstrated in a lot of ways, like I mentioned, Big Bang, laws of conservation of matter, of energy, and so on, that his prediction was true and accurate. Now it's a matter of, okay, so that does seem like the best explanation of reality. Can we get out of this simulation? Or the question that I find to be very interesting is, these guys ignore the question that was more foundational thousands of years ago, and even I would say up till the very recent times, which is, can I have a relationship with? Does this simulator creator want a relationship? You know, if it's a test, what's the goal of the test? And is that test a relationship? Like, what is the point? And so this is where most more modern religions, non-pantheistic religions, have come to the conclusion that there is a relationship there, that the creation of us as conscious beings with things like free will was done out of love. And at the core of the test, Chocolate referencing the Bible in Corinthians says you can have the faith to move mountains, but if you have not love, you have nothing. So faith is one thing, but faith without action, which is expressed through love, is worthless. And I don't believe that Christian religion is the only one that says that, but I think it says it most directly.
Based on it.
And even if you look at something like the Hindu religion, what do they talk about? Reincarnation, right? So we have reincarnation. Well, something still had to start that process. So there's still to be something above that to begin the creation. You also need something to keep track of. Hey, did you get to a high enough level that when you come back in the next life, you're going to be successful and happy and whatever else? Or do you come back as a slug crawling around the earth? Like something is weighing the scales to know where you come and where you end up. So a lot of the religions have come to some version of the question is, where's the ultimate truth and what's the one that makes the most sense?
Interesting thing in the video is that he said we break outside the simulation, which sounds a lot like how do you get to nirvana, how do you get to heaven, how do you get to whatever. And his is to break out through brute force, right? He's to do something. In reality, Brian, yours is saying the test is a different type of test. It's not a brute force test. I'm just gonna hack out of this. It's what is this test trying to teach us, trying to get us to? What level is that to get us out of the simulation? So I thought, everything he says parallels monotheistic religions in the whole concept of test faith. How do you get to the next level? How do you get out of the simulation, which is actually the physical reality world that we're in right now, and all that stuff. So I thought that was interesting that they're taking it as just brute forcing hacking your way out of it, which I don't think will ever work, because they're assuming that the test creator is dumber than what's happening inside the simulation, which they have a assumption that, at least that's kind of what they're saying is, hey, if the AI is smarter, it becomes super intelligent, it's going to be more intelligent than the creator of the simulator. It's like, well, the ultimate simulator is the ultimate thing who created everything, including intelligence and time and space, and is outside of those and sees all of that. There's no way something inside a simulation can see outside of that and actually understand that. So I find that very interesting, that they're literally explaining monotheistic religions with a simulation concept, but they're not giving it accurate attribution.
I think what you're saying, Greg, is they're asking the wrong question.
Well, yeah, always. So it was kind of back to the Aristotle's thing. Aristotle was asking the big questions. They're 4 or 5 levels down from asking those big questions.
Yes. Yeah, I would agree. Yeah, and I'll pick on Elon Musk for a second. Because in our world, we would say, and I almost said it, so the Hindu reincarnation, so you come back as this billionaire and you have whatever you want and so on. But the reality is, many of these billionaires are not happy. They certainly don't have joy in their life. I think Elon Musk is a good example of this. I feel sorry for him to a large degree. He's got, I don't even know how many children now, 11, something like that, children to um, 3 or 4 different women. He doesn't have great relationships with any of them. He isn't seeing them, certainly on a daily basis, maybe on a regular basis. Now, do those kids have access to the best education, to whatever they want as far as tutors or supports or whatever else? Does Elon have the ability to take off a year and go spend time with them and all these things? Yeah. Is he doing any of that? No. He's chasing this concept of, hey, how do I hack this simulation? Instead of saying, wait a sec, there's something bigger. It's not this physical reality that matters, or non-physical. Love, compassion, the virtues that most philosophies have very similar virtues. If he realized that, he wouldn't need to ask this question. So he's looking for this joy in saying, oh, well, I'm stuck here in this simulation that I'm trying to manipulate, instead of saying, wait a sec, the joy is right here. Again, the Christian principle is that heaven on earth, right? That Jesus came to us and said, you can experience heaven on earth. And part of that, certainly not the entirety of it, is those relationships we have with our loved ones. Where does that get fulfilled? Well, it gets more fulfilled in our relationship with God. That's how you get to this perfect relationship. And that starts today when you make that those actions and choices. But even if I was to pretend I cared about God, or prioritize my children and my family over an actual virtuous relationship with God, and maybe Elon even thinks he does that by giving them the best education and resources and things that my kids will never have access to and so on, because I'm not a billionaire. You're still missing the point. The only way that you can be perfectly in love with those people that you care about, and people that, I mean, let's take it to that level, that you don't even know, right? Charitable works are are dramatically higher in terms of time and money given by religious people than those who are non-religious. Why? Because we're required to care about these people that we don't even know. Now, there's a hierarchy and a priority for your family and so on. You can't harm your family or ignore your family or give away everything to feed your family to go feed other people. That would, all society would collapse if that's how we operated. But that doesn't mean I can ignore. There is a necessity to care about these other people. Now, these are the questions that Lex are failing to answer because they're trying to think of hacking out of the matrix.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's the physical world outside of a physical simulation or simulation of physical things.
So here's my take on all this. Simulation theory was designed to help get the atheists on track. Okay.
Yeah.
That's what it's for. It's to help them understand how arrogant they are. I almost guarantee you that on his deathbed, Richard Dawkins will convert. I mean, I don't know. In my impression of the man is 5-year-old, and he has this opinion, and no matter what is shoved in his face, he will absolutely refuse it because his identity is built off of it. But deep down, I am fairly convinced that that man knows truth. And I would almost bet you on his deathbed, whether it's public or private, that man's going to say, I'm sorry to somebody. And that somebody is going to be the big guy.
Well, you see guys like Neil deGrasse Tyson buys into the simulation theory.
Okay,
Right.
so hold on. Let's talk about the simulation and what's outside the simulation, because that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. It's like, what's outside of green? Okay, do you understand? You can't get out of the simulation. It is the universe. It is us. It is God. It is everything. It is the test. There is no final passing of the test.
I think
it is continual.
I agree. I think they see it that way. They think like the multiverse approach, right? What's outside the universe? A multiverse. What's outside the multiverse? A multiverse. I don't know. Like They think a simulation is by maybe other simulations, right? So if we're a simulation and we create a video game simulation, then it's like 7 levels deep of simulations. But they're not asking what's out the ultimate simulation, like the first starting point simulation. They're just assuming that, oh, it could be a simulation within a simulation within a simulation. So that simulation or reality, whatever you want to call it, has to start somewhere. And they don't see that.
No, not even a little bit. The problem is they
Right.
think literally like people out there somewhere with computer systems, and that's what the simulation is. We're all inside of it, you know.
Right.
Completely broke people's brains on reality.
Well,
And what simulation would be and what's outside of it. It's
well,
just
Chuck, do you believe in heaven?
well, absolutely.
So-
I
Would that be outside of the simulation?
do what?
So would heaven be outside of the simulation?
No, that's part of it. I mean, it's all part of it. There is no outside of the simulation.
So is that
You see,
is that completing the test?
it was lonely, and so God wanted to make others because one thing is it's lonely. It needs others.
All right. So,
It makes us and it tests us.
but is the getting to heaven then winning the test? Is that
No, it's not winning a test. That's a nice thought. It's a place we get to go, and it can be here, and it can be elsewhere. It could be the next life. It could be all kinds of things. Life and this simulation we live in are a little bit more complicated than the way we like to see life, because we're three-dimensional creatures and we live in a fourth-dimensional world, but there's 7 different ways of measuring the universe. This okay, you know we're three-dimensional, right? We're you know, you can measure our outsides. And you know what the 4th dimension is? That's a movement, right? That's moving through time. Dimensions aren't places, okay? I don't know where that came from, bad sci-fi, I guess. Dimensions are the way you measure things. Like when you measure your waist, you're measuring the dimensions of your waist. You're measuring something. So dimensions aren't other places. And we are physically 3-dimensional. And we travel 4th dimensionally through a 7-dimensional universe. And what is the 7 dimensions? Well, if you take it all together, that is God. Those are the 7 ways to measure everything in every direction. That is just God. It is.
Right.
And God,
so? What are the 5th, 6th, and 7th dimensions?
well, yeah, you can actually see simulate, or you can kind of, you see my hand moving back and forth? You see
Yeah.
the blur? You see that blur? That
Yeah.
is very tiny perspective of a 5th dimension. You're seeing that object through time. You're seeing, okay, so a 5th dimensional, okay, let's start with the point. You got 1, and then you're going to measure the line across. Okay, that's your 1st dimension. The 2nd thing, you're measuring out the square. We think of that as a flat plane, right?
Right.
When you come up like this, okay, we've now measured up this direction. The 4th thing we measure is its movement, okay, moving. And we often refer to this as time because it takes so long to move from one space to another. But time isn't really it. It's actually the movement from position here to position there. So that's something we've measured. But the 5th thing you measure is from where it started to where it stopped. Okay, that's the 5th thing. So it started here and it ended up over here. This is the 5th dimensional representation of that object. So what is a 6th dimensional representation? It's anywhere that that object could potentially have gone. Those are your multiverses or your other places that you can kind of think about. Doesn't mean they exist. It just means that when you have an object that goes through this travel, you can also potentially have it go this way. So when you measure all of those things, those are that's the 6th thing you can measure is the dimensionals of where it could possibly have gone. So what is the 7th thing you can measure? It's everything from the very beginning of that object through every 5th dimensional, every 6th dimensional interpretation. It's everything. It's all 7 dimensions. And what is everything? It is God.
So
Measure. There is no other thing that you can measure about the universe in physics.
So do you believe that heaven is occupied by physical or non-physical, like spiritual beings?
Absolutely.
You
I'm
think
a
it's,
parent. right?
You're what?
I believe, yes,
So there's a physical and non-physical beings in heaven.
absolutely. Or wouldn't there be?
And when humans die, are they physically or non-physically going there
Yes,
at the same time?
absolutely. Why not? Time doesn't exist. It's one of those things we measure. It's not an actual physical thing. It's just a measurement.
Well, it has a physical reality, but if we're in a non-physical dimension, then it doesn't matter.
Like right now, our conversation when we started, like half an hour ago or whatever, it still exists. It's still there. We've just traveled away from it. It's still there. We can show this with science and with math. The past still exists. It's,
So with regards to the simulation, you're saying what's the goal? Like what's the test then? Because you said that's what a simulation is.
yeah, it's a test.
But what's the test? How do you win?
You don't win.
So what are you being tested for?
Exactly.
You don't know the answer?
Oh no, that's the point. I'm sorry. The point of the universe is to be able to answer the question. It's not something somebody else can give to you. It's something you have to bring from within. You have to
How do you know that?
what your own test is. Because we're not the universe, we're just individual drops from the ocean. And each of our drops has its own path to take. There is no passing of the test. It's
So
just growth.
the test is on an individual basis, not humankind.
Well, I would say definitely not humankind, because we're just part of it. We're just a thing. We're not the whole thing. God's a busy fella. He's got a lot of things in the works, man. Definitely interested in ants. Have you seen what the guy has done with ants? They have some and termites. They have fantastic architectural structures that termites are doing. Tell me that's not the work of God right there. Now,
So it
no.
exists outside of time, so you can't be that busy.
The point of the test, in my opinion, and it's all just opinion, is to help us become better. Because that's what we want.
Well, who defines better?
Exactly. I can't define that because I didn't make the test. I don't.
Right. So then that comes to the question of, did the test maker give us any evidence of what it, he, she, whatever you want to call it, wants as better?
It gets shoved into our face all the time. The problem is we're blind and we don't like to look at that thing. We don't like the advice the universe gives us. I mean, we like to eat that ice cream sundae in front of us, even though we know it's really bad for us. But God will tell us when we take the first few bites and our stomach goes, that's God saying, you probably shouldn't eat that. Oh my
So you're,
stomach.
so you're basically saying that God has endowed us all with this ability to know right from wrong. Maybe we'll call this conscience.
I'm saying there's two states for the universe. There's something's happening and there's something not happening. This is the ultimate heat death. This is entropy. Okay. This is the opposite of entropy. That's everything moving. That's life. That's existence. That's God. Entropy, God. Entropy, God. So what is the test? The test is to see how far we can go in the universe before we hit heat death. We're just trying to keep existing. That's what it's about, is existing. And the reason
Wait
why
a sec.
things that are evil is because they lead us towards entropy.
Do you believe it's possible to not exist?
No, energy can't really be destroyed.
But you are a conscious person, being. Are you destroyable or are you immortal?
Oh no, we can't actually be destroyed. Our souls are immortal.
Well, then your idea of, hey, we're just trying to survive is moot.
Yeah, because you're thinking of time as being a physical thing.
No, I'm not.
Well, see, we're trying to grow the size of the universe, but time doesn't exist. So it just is everything, and we're traveling through it.
Right, but then if you're immortal,
Go
then
on.
there's no need to escape,
There
or
is no-
try to extend or whatever, like doesn't matter. You exist outside of time.
Keep going. You can do. Come on.
Well, that becomes irrelevant then. There's nothing to achieve if you're already immortal.
Does it? think that went out for a while.
I'm just saying your logic isn't adding up to me.
Right. You're almost there, Brian. You are almost there.
Like if you already live forever, the question becomes, is there a good forever and a bad forever, right? So does the simulation have a positive outcome and a negative outcome? And so there's different philosophical approaches to this. There's the Hindus, right, that say, hey, the positive outcome is you come back in a higher level. The negative outcome is you come back in a lower level. There's the, monotheistic religions, your Judaism and Islam and Christianity, which say, well, you go to heaven or to hell, right? There's the naturalist philosophies that end up with various things of with the good gods or the bad gods or whatever. And there's ones that just think it's over. You're not immortal. It's done. Your consciousness does not exist forever. I think there might be some that believe that you're annihilated if you don't pass the test as well.
Well, as I said a little while ago, if you recall, the past still exists. So if the past still exists, yet can't destroy it, so our soul still exists, there's no destroying of that. So in time doesn't
Right.
know that. So no, you can't destroy a soul. It just exists. If something exists, it exists. Now, whether or not you're traveling through a period of space and time where that soul happens to be, that's questionable. I mean, my mother passed away. She's no longer with us physically in this time frame, but my mom still exists. I mean, she's still there in the past where she was. That didn't change. And as far as her immortal spirit, I think, yeah, it's here and around, and it's part of everything. That's what the universe is, right? I mean,
Well, I don't know. Is it part of everything or is it part of nothing? Because it's immaterial, and our universe that we live in now is material.
best. See, I think the key is yes to both of those. Yeah, I know. I have some weird philosophical beliefs. I've explained some of this to Greg in the past, but
So getting back to our test and simulation hypothesis, I think the clear outcome from what these guys said, and maybe we'll summarize it with the last thing that Lex was talking about, is that if you accept that there's a simulation, it's just a modern version of saying the world is too perfect to have been random, to have been just by chance. Something had to create it. Now, whether you want to believe it's a bunch of computer scientists, aliens, or something else is irrelevant. Ultimately, something had to create those. We get back to the first mover. Now, Lex Fridman's last point was about artificial intelligence. I think Robbie wrote this, how does this affect us today? Well, ultimately, people aren't going to be able to trust YouTube. They're not going to be able to trust this video right now because it can be completely rendered. It can be completely artificial. Instead, people are going to want to be in person. And with that, and that somehow would give you an additional level of trust that it's real because I'm physically watching something, which brought to mind for me, Milli Vanilli.
yeah.
Right? I mean, can you trust that? Were lip syncing? Yeah, they were. But for how long did that go on before anybody realized this wasn't reality? Yeah, now you have entire hologram shows of people and artists and producers. So there are problems with the idea that in physical person that you're going to be able to know reality. I hate to bring this up. I'm probably going to get some sort of hate mail, but like WWE, I mean, it can be entertaining. Is that real? I mean, talk to anybody who watches the NFL. A lot of conspiratorial things out there about, hey, are they really just doing their plays, or is there some manipulation here to get the right teams in the right places? I don't know. I don't really watch football, so I just hear people talking about this. So, is being in person really the solution to truth? I don't think it's that simple.
Seems like as good a place as any to end that.